Hello folks, welcome to Marketing 300 Online. I'm Dr. Russ Wallers at Ball State's Miller College of Business. We are broadcasting live and in color again. This week we're in the 12th floor of the James Lowry Digital Studios in beautiful downtown Muncie, Indiana. And we're going to cover a few topics from our text, Chapter 6. The topic is buyer behavior, and we're focusing on the final consumer. After studying the chapter, here are 5 things to look at. We're going to explore how economic needs influence the buyer behavior decision process, also psychological variables and how they affect the individual's buying behavior. We'll examine how social influences affect an individual's buying behavior, and additionally we'll explore how the characteristics of the purchase situation influences the consumer behavior. So our goal is to gain some insight into the process by which consumers make decisions. I don't think we're going to be experts, but the goal is to provide some insight. Here's our roadmap for the material. Last week, you may recall, we took a look at demographic dimensions of final consumer markets in Chapter 6. And in this installment, we're looking at final consumers and their buying behavior. And our focus is largely on 4 areas impacting consumers' behavior. These are shown in this graphic on the screen. These 4 areas are economic needs, psychological variables that have to do with what's going on in the consumer's head, social variables that has to do with how the consumer interacts with others, and the purchase situation itself. We'll talk more about that later. Here, in fact, are some examples of some of the specific issues within each of these 4 categories. And you can see that the consumer decision process is influenced by the marketing mix and other external stimuli. And the result is either a purchase or a non-purchase. So that's our roadmap. There are 3 key psychological constructs in this material that we should discuss briefly. These are needs, wants, and drives. Needs are basic forces that motivate consumers to act in some way. They have to do with the underlying basis for motivation. Wants, on the other hand, are learned needs, which is to say they are needs expressed as a desire for a particular need satisfier, basically a goal object such as a product or service. So in a sense, a want is loosely equivalent to an energized, action-oriented need that directs the consumer toward a particular goal object. Drives, on the other hand, are strong internal stimuli that encourage action to reduce the need. And our framework is that consumers seek benefits to match their needs and wants. They're goal-directed. We're all familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs pyramid as shown here. In marketing, the idea is that these universal hierarchical needs form levels that serve as a foundation for want formation. And the assumption is that, in general, needs at any level will be active only if the lower order needs are at least partially fulfilled. This is particularly relevant in international marketing, where we go into markets where maybe consumers are operating at a lower level need strata than consumers in the U.S. are marketing. But that's basically from the Maslow literature. Another area is perception. Perception refers to how consumers gather and interpret information from the world around them. And this issue is important in marketing in terms of understanding these processes and also understanding that consumers simply cannot process all of the marketing mix stimuli in their environment. There has to be some way that they can regulate the flow of incoming stimuli. So here are three key issues. One is selective exposure, selective perception, and selective retention relating to recall and memory. These three issues are important in developing marketing communications, and they're developed quite nicely in the text, so make sure that you concentrate on this material. Another issue in marketing that we recognize is that almost all consumer behavior is learned. A drive, cue, response, and reinforcement sequence explains a great many types of consumer learning. We talked earlier about what drives are. A cue is basically a stimulus provided perhaps by a marketer that is directive in nature. The response is a behavior, and if the response is satisfying, reflecting a positive reinforcement, that reinforces the linkage between the cue and the response. And it could work just the opposite way as well. Just to carry this one step further, just maybe tossing out a couple examples. You may recall from Psych 101 the Pavlov's dog experiment, which is an example of classical conditioning. And I've drawn this fairly crude way here, but in the Pavlov's dog experiment, you may recall that Pavlov presented a stimulus in the form of food powder to his dog, and that stimulus, food, elicited a salivation response. The pairing between that food stimulus and the salivation response is an innate response that really did not have to be learned by the dog. But then Pavlov paired a bell tone with the food and presented those two stimuli in parallel every time the experiment was run. And over time, the dog learned to associate the bell with the food stimulus, and eventually Pavlov found that you could eliminate the food stimulus altogether and the bell would elicit the same salivation response. And one thing to note, in this experiment, the learner, the dog in this case, is passive. There's no action required. The dog basically just sits there and learns by the pairing of the stimuli. Taking this one step further, here's a marketing application. We do this all the time in advertising. We might have a stimulus such as an attractive spokesmodel featured in an advertisement that we suspect would be linked to a response variable such as happiness or arousal or something good. And what we do is we pair our product with that attractive spokesmodel such that the consumer learns to associate the two. And the idea there is that the product would elicit the same response as the other positive stimulus. So that's an example of classical conditioning. We do that all the time in advertising, as you're obviously aware. Here's another example. This is an example, again, from Psych 101, and this is an example of operant conditioning. And you may recall the experiments done by B.F. Skinner, the behavioral psychologist. I think we call these the Skinner box experiments, where Skinner had a box rigged up with a bar mechanism in the box. And he put a pigeon in the box. When the pigeon pecked on the bar, which was the behavior, the resulting response was the presentation of food, which served as a positive reinforcement to the pigeon. And over time, the pigeon learned to associate that positive response with the behavior, pecking on the bar. So that's an example of operant conditioning, and we use that all the time in marketing as well. Here's an example where maybe the behavior we're trying to induce is for the consumer to use Ultra Bright toothpaste, and the response might be white teeth, happiness, fulfillment, whatever the positive benefits are that we show in the ad. And through feedback, the user learns to associate the anticipated positive reinforcement with the behavior. Um, in this example, the learner is active, has to engage in a behavior, and the positive or negative reinforcement follows the behavior. So there's a subsequent response here. But uh, in marketing, we talk about the making the consumer a unique selling proposition, where we try to find something different about our product, and we present that to the consumer as a selling proposition. Use our brand X and you will receive this benefit. So that the principle is exactly out of Psych 101 here. Note that the learning in this case could be active, and it could also be a result of vicarious observational involvement. We can watch a commercial and see the action of a character in the ad and the response that results, so we can vicariously put ourselves in the ad. We don't have to be actively involved. On another note, much marketing promotion aimed at consumers attempts to either change or reinforce consumers' attitudes. The attitude construct is a very important concept in marketing that you'll study later on in subsequent courses. A couple observations. One is that attitudes are learned points of view towards something as a result of information processing. And attitudes tend to be they're based on beliefs about, in marketing, let's say brand attributes and how well brand attributes possess the benefits that the consumer is interested in obtaining. We talk about having green attitudes and beliefs about sustainability products, and the idea is to create positive attitudes in other respects as well. Meeting expectations is important. Consumers have expectations, and the goal in marketing is to meet those expectations. One comment the authors in our text makes is that attitude change or shaping attitudes or supporting attitudes is possible with creative marketing communication methods. Negative consumer attitudes are very difficult to change, and marketers find it efficient to work with existing attitudes rather than try to radically change consumers' attitudes. So there are limits to this. And another important issue is that when we talk about beliefs as a foundation for attitudes, note that beliefs are based on consumers' perception, not necessarily reality. For instance, you may be marketing a product at a given price, and the consumer has a perception of that price, which may not coincide with reality. And they may shy away from their product because they think the product is overpriced, but they really don't understand the price. So as marketers, we can say, well, the consumer's wrong. Well, that's the consumer is always right. And it's a problem if if consumers' beliefs are not based on fact, because attitudes drive consumer behavior in the sense that attitudes influence preferences, and preferences drive behavior. So this is a very important section in the text to look at. Another important issue in marketing has to do with psychographics. Personality and lifestyle are other psychological factors that affect consumer behavior, and we often refer to psychographics and lifestyle as synonymous terms. Psychographic research in marketing often focuses on lifestyle activities, interests, and opinions. And this slide represents or identifies some examples of activities, interests, and opinions, along with some commonly used demographic variables. These may serve as bases for segmenting markets. So when marketers talk about lifestyle segmentation or psychographic marketing research, this is essentially what they are talking about. So moving on to looking at some social issues that affect consumer behavior. In terms of sociological influences on behavior, social class is an interesting concept. Social class refers to the stratification of people into groups sharing approximately equivalent social status. And this is a rough measure, but it's important because lifestyle is largely driven by one's social class. And lifestyle affects consumption choices. So in this sense, this is an important concept in marketing. It's an input to understanding how consumers act the way they do. And note in this graphic there are four primary determinants of social class. This is based on Warner's Index of Status Characteristics, if you want the reference. Occupation, education, type of housing, and also housing location. Those are typically four factors that are largely responsible for categorizing consumers into social strata. Of these four, occupation tends to be the most highly correlated with social status. And note that income is not a variable that we consider here. Income is loosely related, but it's not the same thing. And there's some examples where social class and income are not quite correlated. As an explanatory variable, social class is a more efficient variable to explain behavior than income by itself. Other social influences that we could talk about include reference groups. Reference groups could be groups that we're members of, clubs, church groups, sororities, fraternities, even the family is a reference group. Opinion leaders also have a social influence on behavior and also culture. So all of these things taken collectively represent a range of social influences. Finally, in addition to psychological and social influences, buyer behavior is also driven to some extent by the characteristics of the purchase situation. It could be the reason for the purchase, whether we're buying a product for ourselves or maybe as a gift for others, just as an example. Time available, we all know how time pressures change our decision-making ability. We find that to be a big impact in marketing. And also physical surroundings, the mood created by the store environment perhaps, who's shopping with us, and so forth. So those are some purchase situation factors that impact on behavior. So now that we've touched on several basic concepts, here's an expanded model of consumer behavior. The yellow area is the consumer decision process, and it all starts with need awareness, recognizing the need for a product. And these are notice that the consumer decision process is influenced by these types of variables that we talked about before. And we need to recognize that there's a continuum of problem-solving complexity. For very simple purchase situations, we often find the consumer recognizes a need and engages in habitual routine response behavior without much cognitive activity. For more involved purchase decisions, problem solving is required, some type of cognitive information processing, and the consumer engages in that case in acquiring information, identifying alternatives, establishing criteria that alternatives are evaluated against, and then actually doing that evaluation. Purchase may or may not take place. If it does, there's also some behavior after the purchase decision that feeds back to the beginning of the process. So regarding this notion of a continuum of problem-solving complexity, here's a graphic that shows the range ranging from extensive on the right to routine response behavior on the left. You might note the characteristics that tend to determine problem-solving complexity shown at the top of this graphic. And in particular, the level of involvement that the consumer brings into the purchasing situation. Involvement's a key determinant of problem-solving complexity. And here's another slide that expands on that idea just a bit. Involvement is basically the importance that the consumer attaches to a purchase situation. You could perhaps in some cases view it as excitement, importance, and it's basically related to the consumer's perception of risk surrounding the purchase situation. And the risk could take many different dimensions. We could be talking about social risk, which is often an issue when we consider luxury good purchases that are conspicuously consumed. There's financial risk attached to buying major appliances because we're talking about big ticket items. Safety risk, any safety or security related good would contain some perceived level of safety risk. Performance risk, goods that must perform well. If you're a student and you're picking out a laptop computer to perform certain activities, you want to pick one that does the job. So that is a risk factor. And also psychic risk, which is related to self-concept, the idea of self-actualization. So understanding consumers' involvement is important because involvement and the motivation for the consumer to process information is directly related. If the consumer is involved in high degrees of involvement in the purchase situation, that consumer will be more inclined to listen to what the marketer has to say, read advertising copy thoroughly, pay attention to advertisements, and so forth. And it's interesting because most of the products that we buy in our daily life are not high involvement products. They're usually low involvement products, soft drinks, staple food goods, and so forth. So for low involvement products and services, consumers just are not motivated to invest the mental energy to think much about the purchase of those products. There's a lot of implications for marketing, especially in the area of media. If you're writing ad copy, for instance, for a low involvement product, you have to keep it brief because the consumer is just not motivated to read much copy. And involvement often varies for the same product across different consumers in different segments. So for one consumer, purchasing let's say a dress shirt could be a very low involvement product purchase. For another consumer, it could be a very highly involving product purchase because that consumer may attach more risk to the purchase. So it all goes back to risk, and it's a very important concept to think about. We'll talk about that later in the text in a couple other different ways. Be sure to read over the material in the text on the adoption process. This is basically a series of steps or mental stages the consumers go through from the time they're exposed to new products until the time they perhaps become brand loyal consumers. And it's marketers' job to help lead the consumer through those steps in the adoption process. Our text talks a lot about dissonance. Cognitive dissonance may set in after the purchase. Dissonance basically is the uneasy feeling we all have when we buy major products and services after the fact. Did I make the right decision? And there's a lot of things marketers can do to try to reduce dissonance after the sale. Even a follow-up phone call from a sales rep might be appropriate. So this pretty much wraps up a discussion of some of the key issues in this chapter. Be sure to review these terms at the end of the section as a good tool for study purposes. And be careful out there, and we'll see you online soon. Thanks.